Crazy Mill flipped out and cut us from the will unless we gave her a baby. But then, my husband got a massive promotion and she completely lost it. My name is Rachel, 31F, and I've been married to my husband Brian, 33 male, for 5 years after dating him for 3 before that. While my parents have always been hands-off and let me make my own choices, Brian's mother, my Mill, is the polar opposite, always in everyone's business, especially ours. Back when Brian and I were dating, Mill hounded us non-stop about getting married, since we were both already so old, her words. And it was apparently humiliating for her to tell her friends her son was still unattached. Eventually, Brian and I got married, because we wanted to, not because of pressure, but her next obsession started: babies. Over and over, she insisted it was time for us to have a child. I tried to explain that I just wasn't ready, but she never let up. For 5 years this has gone on. Meanwhile, Brian's dad, my FIL, told him just to let her rant and ignore it. Mill, according to him, always ran the household. Good for female power, not so much for us because she's so controlling and really only cares about how things look to her little circle of friends, who seem to do nothing but compare their kids and grandkids all day. It matters way more to her what they think than what Brian or I feel. Brian actually tried multiple times to tell her to back off about grandkids, but she never listened. And when he brought it up with his dad, it was a dead end. Phil said keeping the peace was more important, and if we stood up to her, it would just be endless drama. So we kept quiet for years, mainly for our own sanity. I tried to avoid confrontations, but after so long, it got almost impossible not to snap. That finally happened 2 weeks ago, when Mill and Phil came for dinner. She wouldn't stop talking in my kitchen about some herbal tea guaranteed to help you get pregnant. I was so annoyed, I blurted out, "If you're this obsessed with babies, maybe you should have had a few more yourself and left me out of it." She was finally silent after that, and honestly, I didn't regret it for a second, especially after what happened next. To my surprise, for the next couple of meetings, she actually didn't bring up kids or pregnancy, and Brian and I were grateful for the breather. She even started visiting less often, only briefly speaking to Brian and ignoring me completely when she did come over. A part of me worried I'd made her mad enough to jeopardize our chance of inheriting anything. I know it sounds transactional, but my in-laws are pretty wealthy, and Brian and I have always figured things would be easier with their help someday. It's practical, even if it isn't romantic, and kind of the only reason we've put up with her as long as we have. Anyway, this entire time we were basically counting down until Brian could get a promotion, and we'd finally move away. Our house, a wedding gift from his parents, was right near theirs, which limited our independence, especially given Mill's no-boundaries approach to life. Brian hated it as much as I did. The plan was to save up and move the moment we could. 3 days ago, the big promotion Brian had been busting his butt for finally came through. He's now in management at the bank, complete with his own office and a giant raise. Between his new salary and my income, I'm a realtor, we're already well off, but now we're actually rich. I'm not bragging, but I'm so proud of him, he's earned it. The best part was, we'd finally be able to move out soon and escape his mother's scrutiny. We decided to host his parents for a celebratory dinner to mark Brian's big achievement and also announce our plan to move out. As a realtor, I'd already shortlisted some great houses for us. Maybe it was premature, but we wanted to share the good news. When Mill and Phil arrived that evening, Mill barely acknowledged me, obviously in a foul mood. Phil did most of the talking at dinner while she sulked. After we ate, just as we were about to make our announcement, Mill stood up and declared she had her own news. Thinking nothing of it, we let her go first, which turned out to be the best decision ever. With a dramatic flourish, Mill announced that she had removed Brian from her will and was going to get Phil to do the same, unless we had a child within a year. She didn't care if it was adoption or surrogacy. She just needed a grandchild, period. She called us an embarrassment, accusing us of denying her the joy of being a grandparent. If we didn't comply, all their inheritance would go to charity. The situation was so surreal that we just stared at her. Even Phil looked completely shocked. He obviously hadn't been consulted. I couldn't believe she was actually doing this, but for her, it was a genuine threat, or would have been a few months ago. But after Brian's promotion, we didn't need their money anymore. I told her as much when I finally found my words. I explained that the reason for the dinner was to announce Brian's promotion, and now her threat was meaningless. As soon as she realized Brian had made it big at the bank and she wouldn't get to flaunt a successful son before her friends, just as she'd spent years shaming him for not being further along in his career, her face fell. She had ruined what should have been a proud family moment. I wasn't about to let her dampen this occasion, so I said, if she truly saw us as an embarrassment just because we were childless, she should leave our house. She was obviously taken aback. Once words are out, you can't unsay them. I could tell she immediately regretted it. She started backpedaling, plastering on a fake smile, trying to congratulate Brian and acting like grandkids could wait a bit after all. By then, Brian had gotten himself together and looked devastated. When Mill tried to hug him, he stepped away and let out years of pent-up frustration. I dealt with her for 5 years, but Brian had endured it his entire life. He ended up in tears, which is so unlike him, and I told his parents to leave as calmly as I could. Mill looked distraught and tried to stay to talk it out, but I insisted she leave and that we'd all talk when human again. Phil tried one of his feeble apologies, but honestly, it was way too late. If he'd ever stood up to Mill, maybe things wouldn't have ended up like this. After they left, I spent an hour comforting Brian, who was a wreck. His relationship with his parents, already strained, seemed beyond repair, and there was nothing left for us to do. They'd made their choices. They'd had their chances to be supportive, loving parents. Now that Brian's actually achieved something amazing, I don't see why they should share in the happiness. Mill had always put unbearable pressure on Brian, making him feel like he was never enough, and Phil just stood back and let it happen. Half an hour later, Mill tried calling, wanting to speak to Brian right now. I told her she'd lost the right to talk to him whenever she wanted. She'd have to go through me. She did not like this at all, and quickly got snippy, so I hung up. Soon after, she started texting me, blaming me for turning Brian materialistic, for ruining their relationship, and for not giving her grandchildren. She said everything was my fault. I was greedy. I'd refused to marry Brian in my old age, and now I refused to have a baby. According to her, I was making Brian care more about money than family. I'll admit, her accusations made me feel pretty awful. Maybe we are practical about money, but we never demanded anything from his parents. We just wanted our lives to be easier. I don't think it's fair to blame this all on me. But with Brian asleep and none of my friends available, I had nowhere to turn. Was I wrong to stand up to Mile? Did I go too far when she called us an embarrassment and cut us from her will because we don't have a child? Edit. Thanks so much for everyone's responses and support. It really means a lot. It's been nearly 2 days since that dinner, and there's been no communication between us and my in-laws, at least not any that Brian's be willing to pick up. Mile has tried to get in touch, even showing up at our house last night, but Brian refused to speak to her. He's absolutely done. The morning after the dinner, we discussed everything thoroughly. I even showed Brian Miles' texts blaming me for everything. He reassured me none of this was my fault, and admitted he himself had only kept the relationship going because of the anticipated inheritance. If not for that, he would have cut off his parents a long time ago. They never gave him any emotional support, so the least they could do was help him financially someday. He doesn't care how materialistic he sounds. He's been through enough. Now, with the promotion and our new financial security, neither of us need the inheritance. Miles already removed him from the will, so any hope of patching things up seems gone. We both agreed that going no contact was necessary and justified. Mile, meanwhile, continued to barrage me with texts, trying to guilt me into fixing the situation, but blaming me every step of the way. If she'd ever been a better mother to Brian, he wouldn't be cutting her off. And if she'd been a decent Mile to me, I wouldn't be letting it happen. She failed on both counts, so really, she only has herself to blame. Update 1. Brian and I finally settled on a house and are planning to start moving soon. Today, he called Phil to tell him about our decision. Phil was really upset, tried to talk him out of it, but Brian was firm. He told Phil that he'd always hoped he'd stand up to Mile, but it never happened. This was the result. So Phil had no right to complain now. If Phil was upset, Mile moved to another level. She was outright devastated when she heard the news that we were really moving. When she came over to plead with Brian yesterday, he let her in for one last conversation. I didn't want anything to do with it, so I stayed in the bedroom. Afterwards, Brian filled me in. He told her he didn't want to keep in touch after all she'd done, the years of pressure. The make your son compete for mother's love games, while she kept insisting it was only ever to help him succeed. But everyone knows her true motivation is impressing her friends. Their conversation escalated until she was crying, begging, actually yelling at him not to leave. Brian told her firmly that he was an adult who could make his own decisions. That set Mile off. She began screaming, throwing pillows, absolutely losing her mind. I came out to check what was happening and tried, very briefly, to talk her down. But then she just turned her fury on me, accusing me of stealing her son. At that point, Phil finally arrived and managed to haul her away, even as she struggled against him. It was sad, honestly, but more than anything, a relief to have her out of the house. Brian said letting her in had been a mistake. She only wanted to control him, never recognize him as an adult, and today proved it. After what happened, neither of us want to see her again. Moving can't happen soon enough. Update 2. I have incredible news, and it's changed everything. Turns out that the reason I've been so emotionally up and down lately is I'm pregnant. I took a test a few days ago, and now I can finally say we're expecting. With Brian's promotion and now this, it feels like the stars have lined up for us perfectly. For obvious reasons, neither of us have told his parents. In fact, we've blocked them everywhere. Brian made it clear to Phil that if Mill ever turns up uninvited again, he'll call the police. Phil agreed to leave us alone, but you could tell he wasn't happy. It's a little ironic that Mill has been so desperate for grandkids that she ruined any chance of being part of her grandchild's life. If she'd only backed off for a few weeks, she'd have gotten what she wanted. Now, she's cut herself off completely. To be honest, I'm relieved she showed her true colors before our baby arrived. I want no part of her toxicity anywhere near my child, or me, especially when pregnancy is stressful enough. We're already mid-move, and we'll make sure our new address remains a secret. The last thing I need is Mill showing up at the new place while I'm pregnant. Now, we're just focusing on our little family, and I couldn't be happier for the future. This story ends right here. This story highlights how clinging to appearances and control can shatter family bonds permanently, even when there's a genuine chance for reconciliation. Sometimes, letting go of toxic expectations, even at the cost of inheritance or tradition, is what allows people to finally build the life they want. Here is a question for you. Have you ever cut ties with a family member because they couldn't respect your boundaries? Or would you try to keep the peace no matter what? Let me know in the comments.